So after watching Ken Ham and Bill Nye the Science Guy debate on whether creation is relevant or evolution is relevant, I've come to the conclusion that both um, use their information in a way that speaks to adults or four different groups of adults. They speak to a group of educated creationists, those who know what they're talking about, and that are hard on scripture, using that scripture proves creationism. They speak to uneducated creationists, those who are easily swayed, those who are just going to hear a good argument, those that if you speak well enough and use large enough words, they will be swayed to a different belief. They also speak to the educated evolutionists, who are, as opposed to the educated creationists, concrete in their belief that the Earth was created through evolution, so on and so forth, single cell organisms. And then the uneducated evolutionists, those who think they understand the Big Bang Theory, the 6,000 year debate, things of that nature. Topic I wanted to bring out is how Ken Ham only really had the argument of faith, because essentially both of them argue the same exact thing. Bill Nye and Ken Ham both had the same points. They were pretty much just arguing a difference on, are you going to believe me or are you going to believe him? Ken Ham used several scriptures throughout his entire presentation, referencing anywhere from Genesis all the way, I believe he went to the New Testament. In doing so, he proved, or he attempted to prove, that the earth was created roughly 6,000 years ago. But a falter in his debate was when he mentioned several times about the Grand Canyon and plants and life in itself. The Grand Canyon within itself clearly proves the Earth is well over 6,000 years old. This was made even more evident when he brought up Noah and the flood, which was even more than 6,000 years ago, which Bill Nye picked up on and used that in his argument. One key thing, though, that stood out about their arguments and how adults are different in learning than children. Both are very educated men. Both debated without arguing or getting upset with one another. They both let each other have their allotted time. I believe the first parts of their speech was 5-minute introductory statement, then like a 30-minute background, then like 5-minute rebuttals back and forth, so on and so forth. Those were to prove that an educated debate and an educated discussion does not have to take place in arguing, as many of us are accustomed to. But back to the topic at hand on whether evolution or creationism is a relevant argument. Ken Ham did bring out one very good point, that in explaining this argument, you need to understand the terminology being used, because many people who make this argument have no idea what they're talking about. In teaching adults, you can be a little more general, and while being general, you can also be a little bit more concrete. You don't need to be as creative necessarily, because adults can understand the harder concepts. As in when Kenneth Ham brought in the Noah's Ark argument, which Bill Nye did an excellent job of negating, because he brought in the point that there have been several attempts to build wooden ships of the same size, but it was not able to be done. But the wooden ships was about 3/4 of the size, and it was destroyed because of the bending and the twisting and the turning, which is true. It holds up in physics. His math was correct. Kenneth Ham, on the other hand, used that example, but essentially his example only had grounds on the scripture said it, so I believe it. And that is unfortunately the argument of 95% of creationists. Well, scripture says it, so I believe it. Which, for all intents and purposes, is what many Bible believers should stick to. But for Bible believers who are willing to be open-minded, not that those that are scripture to the core are not open-minded, but those who are willing to think outside of the box, understand and see that you cannot hold the scripture as concrete when it comes to historical evidence or scientific evidence, because it is very much true that a ship created out of wood or any material that cannot be welded or sealed will experience much more of the twisting and the bending that will allow water to seep through and essentially submerge the ship. Also, Kenneth Ham used the argument that it was also almost a pointing the finger argument that evolution and creationism has been hijacked by secularists, to a certain extent, which I, to a certain extent, agree with, but mostly feel that that was a bit of an underdeveloped argument. To say that the phrase evolution or creationism was hijacked is to say that creationists explained it in the first place, or they gave it its due justice. But creationists allowed this to happen and allowed that false understanding to get out there. So therefore, it wasn't necessarily hijacked. It was more so given away because people were very simple-minded and were not able to understand what was being said or what was being talked about, because many people who are firm believers in Scripture are not firm believers in science. But Kenneth Ham did bring out a great point that there are many creationists who are doctors in physics, chemistry, astronomy, astrophysics, things of that nature. So it is possible to take Scripture and combine it with science and have a belief that creationism is possible. But Kenneth Ham did not pose that argument into a way that would speak to adults, because he was speaking to more of the undereducated creationists who would be like, oh yeah, he used Scripture, so that makes perfect sense. But those that were educated creationists and educated evolutionists, can know and understand that just because the Scripture said it doesn't make it concrete. And then I'm sure there are going to be those people who say, well, that statement makes you an atheist or a vagabond or a hypocrite. No, it doesn't. But that speaks to what category that you were in, the uneducated creationist or the uneducated evolutionist.